Thank you very much, and really thanks to everybody for joining us. We've got a packed agenda truly for the next 30 minutes, but today we have the luxury. Often when I talk about Orca, it's at a level where the technology is a little bit abstracted. We talk about sort of infrastructure as a service providers in general, but today I have the luxury of talking about Orca in the specific context of AWS, which is a real treat. We'll take about the next 30 minutes. At the end, if we have questions, we'll try to get to them. It's a packed agenda, so no promises there, but certainly I will leave lots of information on how to get in touch with me following the event as well. Okay, so it's hard to believe, I think, looking back, that Orca is yet to have our third birthday, right? So in less than 3 years, Orca has been able to really sort of flip the tables on the CSPM, CWPP market. If you're familiar with those terms, those are Gartner terms, and we'll talk about them further in our presentation. But, they're categories of security tool that we've sort of re-envisioned, and we're going to talk about what's gone into that vision really shortly. But, we have 8 very technical co-founders. I think that's part of the reason we've been able to accelerate so quickly and build a truly world-class enterprise-ready solution. Through several rounds of funding, we're very well funded, and we've been growing very, very quickly based on that success. So as I alluded to, there really are 3 pillars that we hold very true at Orca. The first is coverage, right? Right now, I think in the cloud security landscape, one has to not only acquire, but really become very, very proficient in more than 1 or 2 or 3 tools to get that complete coverage, right? We have CSPMs, we have Cloud Workload Protection Platform, CWPPs, and then even outside of that, we have some capabilities perhaps that those platforms don't have, and we have specific point solutions, and we think that that leaves a lot of opportunity on the table for observation sharing. When we talk about, observations we find down deep inside of workloads, they're always informed by, the security controls around them at the cloud level. Those two are intimately connected together, right? And tools that look at one or the other as sort of discrete vectors of concern, if you will, really miss the mark. And so for us, coverage includes, deep down in the workload, out in terms of the most obscure cloud services you use. That's what coverage means to us. Comprehensive, very, very related, right? One tool to do the job, and really one tool that shares observations from one side of the equation to the other, as we talked about. When we find security risks down deep in workloads, they are not in isolation. The very next question we usually have is, how exposed is that risk? And that's a question you can't answer just looking at the workload. So it's really important we look at all the vectors, and we're going to talk about what those are. And then lastly, really context is the result of doing the first 2 properly. If you're looking at all of those areas or vectors of concern, and if you're looking at all the services you consume on an infrastructure as a service platform, then what you're left with, if you do it right, is a bunch of context that's very, very useful for risking alerts, and we'll talk about why that's so essential. We're really fortunate to have customers go on record to provide public testimonials, really from, if you look at IT security firms, I think, 10 times Orca's size, you'll probably find less. I think we're up to just about 20. And we're really proud of that, right? We work diligently with customers to understand their needs and to tune our platform. And, certainly as we launched the platform was a vision of early customer consultation, but that only increases as Orca evolves. And it's really thanks to the people you see on the slide here. In specific with AWS, we've really invested heavy in that partnership, both from a competency perspective. So Orca is a security competency partner at AWS. And there's some other sort of high-level programs there that we're looking at as well. But then also from a real specific technology perspective, right? When we see a program where Orca can make a real difference, we want to participate. And so you'll see the Linux 2 service ready, right? Where Orca understands Amazon Linux and Amazon Linux 2 very well as a discovery platform, right? If your workloads are based on that platform, Orca understands the structure of that operating system such that we can side scan it. And that's what we're going to be talking about next. We provide support for the AWS specific CIS benchmarks on the compliance side. Orca has really, really simple, always on, always ready compliance. And the AWS specific CIS benchmarks are a big part of that. And we'll talk about that, as well as the workload specific benchmarks that we support as well. And then feature by feature, certainly if you're familiar with Private Link, that's a way for your sort of traffic that's AWS bound to stay within the AWS network. Orca has support for that, as we do for Image Builder as well. Okay, so let's take a short history lesson on how we effectively manage risk today, whether it's in your data center or it's in your cloud environment. Really, although it's evolved, and of course workloads have virtualized, network appliances have virtualized, the theory is very, very similar. First, we have workload agents, and agents are applications that run alongside your mission critical applications, and effectively we have to treat them the same way, right? We have to deploy them, we have to maintain them. When we don't, if we run the risk of sort of workloads becoming orphaned and out of our visibility, and orphaned workloads and unsupervised workloads are a little bit like unsupervised children, right? They find ways to get into trouble, and that's kind of one of the main challenges with agents. We'll talk about that as we go. Another approach has been the network scanner, and the network scanner kind of comes either in a unauthenticated or an authenticated flavor, right? If it's unauthenticated, it can peer only so far into workloads. It can tell what they are, what operating systems are running, and similar to what a CSPM can tell. If you launch a workload from Amazon, an EC2 workload, and you say it's based on Red Hat Linux, that's actually something I can query through the Amazon API. Right. And so an unauthenticated network scanner, insofar as workload discovery, isn't that dissimilar from what a CSPM can do. Very light touch. But an authenticated scanner can peer inside. Obviously, it's got credentials to log in and go a little bit deeper. Of course, then the scanner holding the credentials can become a security concern in certain kind of scenarios as well. That's one of the drawbacks of network scanners. But these are the two technologies we've used. And then in about maybe the last 5 or 7 years, we've seen a third category debut, and that's the CSPM, or the Cloud Security Posture Manager. And that, rather than looking kind of at workloads as agents and scanners do, this looks at what we call the cloud control plane, the service fabric of your infrastructure as a service provider. In this case, of course, AWS. So tools and solutions like this ask questions of the AWS API. Show me all of my S3 buckets. Show me all of my publicly exposed S3 buckets. That's a very, very popular CSPM kind of test. And that's squarely where they're aimed, right? All of the services I use at AWS, I need to know where the security controls and knobs are at any given time. I may just need to know that for my own governance and sort of security situational awareness, if you will, or I may need to know that because I am kind of formally regulated from a data security standard, and I have to have confidence that all those security controls are always maintained to that standard, right? Not really different how you do it. There may be a different in the vigilance, but the technology is the same. So when we sat back, we really found two main problems with these approaches, right? And the first is that agent deployments don't scale, right? When you have to deploy your solution on every resource to gain any level of visibility about it, in a modern cloud environment, that's really hard, right? The first bullet point there, impossible to deploy everywhere. If you are trending towards or have already moved towards kind of this DevOps scenario where you've got teams tasked with continuous software build and release, a very popular strategy is to try to get security involved in that. There is a fundamental challenge when security teams tell developers, hey, you've got to install this agent in every workload you're building, either in a lab, in development, or in production. It doesn't matter. We have a strong governance and security policy, which is great, but you're sort of dependent on the team that you want to govern to first install this workload agent for you, right? The relationship is sort of fraught with challenges right from the start. So, we sort of sat back and said, is there a way to solve this in a more modern way that doesn't require that? Hint, there absolutely is, and we'll talk about that soon. The other is, my workload has to compete with your trusted and often mission-critical applications, right? I have to be careful how much CPU I consume as a workload agent vendor, because the last thing I want to do is kind of consume that CPU for me and leave little for your running application. After all, that's the purpose of this workload, right? And so that's a challenge. Getting it deployed everywhere. We talk about the DevOps scenario, but that's very true of if you're trying to govern centrally, as many of our enterprise customers do. They try to do that centrally. They try to cover every business unit, every discipline, every project team that's leveraging the cloud so that they can kind of manage top down. Well, again, if you're relying on these teams to quote unquote do the right thing from a security perspective, we're already in trouble. Let's try and find a solution where we can have that top-down perspective, and we don't have to run around and try to integrate per resource. With ephemeral resources that come up and down and live for seconds, maybe short minutes, all of this becomes a real challenge, and they break the assumptions that these tools were built for, right? The much slower moving data center. The other problem is that there are simply too many sort of security alerts, right? We found on average that organizations will discover 10,000 vulnerability alerts for every 100 assets. And the reason for that is that, we're using multiple tools that really only work in their respective silos. And we've talked about this. They don't really understand the full picture. They don't understand the context right around each workload. We talk about context as network kind of surrounding. That's a big part of context, but it's not the only factor. We'll talk about the other kinds of data that go into this sort of context equation. But with an agent approach, really the onus or the responsibility of adding the context to the alert to make it meaningful does really fall on the security team. And it's one of the reasons that they're absolutely drowning in alerts. There's really very little prioritization, and the result is alert fatigue and distrust in the alerts. And we know from very high-profile public breaches, we learned of the Target breach in 2013 and more in 2014 that the alert wasn't missed, or rather was missed. The alert was posted, right? That sort of was indicative of the malware that led to the breach. It was just lost in a sea of other always high profile, often false positive alerts, and they weren't trusted, and that was the problem. So, context is truly the answer, and we're going to talk about why. But before we do, let's talk about how Orca can do what it does without any code installed really anywhere in your environment, right? We talk about no agents. There's no code running in your environment at all. Let's talk about how that works. So, we're able to detect really all of the important security risks within a workload without running code anywhere, without anything deployed in your network, certainly any agents. How we do that is that Orca connects to your the runtime block storage of AWS, right? AWS were clever enough to separate the compute plane from the storage plane, and of course, incidentally, as you know, from the network plane. These are all separate areas of the AWS console, separate API calls, and that's for a very distinct reason. Orca really leverages that, right? And is able to say, okay, every time I see a new workload, and you'll hear kind of an EC2 instance as my default example, but absolutely that means containers on instances, containers as a service, either through ECS or EKS, all of the ways you can run a container on AWS are supported by Orca. And it's lovely to say, and it's a pleasure to say, even if you're running individual Docker containers on top of your EC2 instances, Orca, once it does this side scanning approach, looks for that, inventories them as containers, and we'll show you examples of that in the demo as well. So we connect to that runtime block storage, and then we supplement it with the cloud metadata of that workload, right? There's a lot of value in there. And of course, that's kind of where the value of a CSPM ends. They take that metadata, they share it with you. Orca does this mixture of all the risks we find down deep in the workload through the side scanning process, and then combine it with this cloud metadata. And the result is a very, very sort of potent mix, right? It enables us to understand the connection between different resources and allows Orca to build the necessary context. We talked about how important that is, and we will in a moment again, to truly understand your environment in its entirety. So instead of integrating with each workload, one of the benefits of doing this the way that we do and integrating at the storage level is that Orca doesn't require credentials. Right. So if you acquire a new project, a new company, they have cloud infrastructure. M&A is famously difficult to do. One of the reasons are, understanding where everything is, how to log into it. One of the real benefits of this process is you don't need to know the credentials to workloads, right? You simply turn Orca on, connect, and we're going to talk about how Orca is deployed. If it's not deployed per resource, how is it deployed? We'll get there. And immediately, every resource that Orca sees, it begins to apply this side scanning method to, and very, very quickly you understand a lot of risks in your environment that a CSPM can't tell you, and a cloud workload protection platform takes weeks and months of deploying to get to the point where it can tell you, or can tell you that in 5 hours. So let's have a look. There's really 4, I guess, pillars or life after Orca, as we like to talk about, that all Orca customers enjoy. And we talked about what our pillars are. The first one is 100% coverage. By virtue of the way we do this, and we connect with an AWS role and a policy, much like you'll find modern tools, other security tools, cost optimization tools, right? They all tend to integrate this way. I think the magic with Orca is that we use that to dive deeper than really any of these tools do in terms of the very specific risks within workloads. We say workloads a lot, but in that statement, we also mean storage containers, right? The Orca does this very same side scanning technique, albeit with a few subtle differences, against your public-facing storage containers as well, right? So we'll talk about the kinds of risks we're looking for. They include not just traditional ones, but sensitive data, PII detection, all of that. So that applies both to workloads and storage buckets. So 100% coverage for all types of resources that you're leveraging. The second is that we aim to solve more than one problem, right? And we do that because we think the scenario is just so ripe for it. If we're looking at, again, these tests at the cloud control plane level, and then we're looking at these tests at the workload level, doing those discreetly and in their own silos is part of the problem, is part of the reason that we flood our security administrators with so many alerts, right? Because if I have malware, for example, in one spot, that is really, really only in one spot, that isn't able to be contacted from the outside the internet, but maybe not even from the inside, right? Truly contained on one machine, versus that very same malware on another that is public facing. What do I do about that scenario? It's an overly simplistic one, of course. I would fix the public facing one and then go fix the private one. But in a sea of alerts, right, where I may have 100 or 200 of those very high profile, hey, if you don't fix this, it has a high probability of being remotely exploited, right? But I'll lose those in a sea of alert where everything is high severity, where every tool only considers itself and therefore risks every risk as high severity, right? I will lose that. And so the true benefit, obviously there's a cost and an ROI benefit to having multiple tools in one, but the true benefit is the information sharing between them, all in the name of context. And I'm going to show you exactly how powerful that is. And so we really do aim to be, look at traditional software vulnerabilities, and we roll them up in a way that's truly actionable, right? Rather than dumping a list of, hundreds and thousands of CVEs in your lab. In that we look for malware as well. And because of the side scanning method, the way we look for malware, we can spend a lot of CPU cycles on, right? Again, because we're doing this from the side, out of band from your running application. So we're taking, a quick look, a quick snapshot, if you will, of a workload. It continues to run without problem, but we deep dive into it, and we're able to, even change a phenomenon like polymorphic malware that re-encrypt itself every time it's run to look different to scanners that are looking at trivial things like, a file name or a hash. Right. And so we can do that because we're not worried about competing with CPU with your application. We do this completely out of band from that process. And so there are some really, really unique advantages that come with the method that Orca utilizes. Insecure configurations, authentication risks, sensitive data. We talked about PII, but that's not it, right? There's the keys that lead to lateral movement. Keys that cloud keys, not necessarily SSH keys, that developers left embedded in a test script, right? Orca will catch those, and we'll show you more about that soon. So the result really of combining those tools, not only combining the tools in one, but then sharing information, between them in the way of context, the result is, more trust in your alerts that matter. And so let's take a look at an example, right? A lot of tools will represent inventory or risk, sort of like what you see on this slide here, right? A big list of resources, resource types. If you get coverage at all, which you do sort of on this cloud workload protection side, you'll get a list of discrete vulnerabilities on an EC2 instance, if you're lucky, in a container, but that'll be it, right? On the CSPM side, you'll get coverage for these kinds of resources. A lot of them, my storage buckets, my networking, but the coverage is trivial, right? It's a list of security controls and how they deviate. In the case of S3, it's great. It'll protect your buckets from being public. But if a bucket is public, I want to be really sure, and maybe, not maybe, there are many times when a bucket is intentionally public. If that's the case, I want another layer of protection that if anybody ever misplaces sensitive data in that bucket, for example, that's meant to be public, I want to know about that as well. And that's something that a CSPM has no perspective over. A CWPP, being workload specific and not storage bucket specific, actually has no perspective over either. It's something that, these two tools actually won't cover at all, but Orca does. So let's look at how. So the first difference you'll find in Orca is that, we don't think of your resources as a simple list, right? The relationship between them, the networks between them, we see it like an attacker sees it, like somebody who's landed in your network and is looking around. That's how we represent your environment internally in the data model of Orca. And that lets us always understand these relationships such that when the site scanning process, for example, does come along and it finds data within a workload. In this case, this looks like an EC2 based Bastion server, and we find keys in it. Because Orca has done this for every single workload, right? As soon as you debut a new instance or container in your AWS estate, because of the integration Orca has, we know about it. And so, the side scanning process happens, and because that happens reliably every single time a resource either debuts or on a regular schedule, we can say, look, not only did we find a key, we can tell you what these keys map to, because we've already found these resources. They're in that data model, not simply as discrete items, but as how they relate to each other. And so finding a key isn't the end of the story with Orca, as it is with just about every other approach to the problem. Orca then is smart enough to say, hey, that key, if it's an SSH or a session key, or if it's one half, we'll tell you where the other half is, and therefore what that key can access, right? It may be a key we found deep internally, but it can access workloads on the edge. And that's a very scary scenario. The reverse is even scarier, right? If I have a bad actor land on the edge in a Bastion host, for example, I really don't want to be able to have them find credentials to workloads deeper into my network. So that's what Orca provides. The power of that context is not just, hey, I found something that may provide access. It's I found a key that, or credentials, or AWS credentials stuffed in a configuration file, and here's what they provide access to. That's truly the power of context, and you won't find a CSPM that can do that. One, because they're poor at context, but two, because they have no workload sort of perspective, right? But that's the idea of building Orca from the ground up, as this CSPM and CWP offering that share information back and forth. Incidentally, it's sort of what Gartner expected some time ago, right? For the CSPM kind of capability set to merge with the CWPP, they found that to be a very powerful mix if done right. And for me, definitely Orca was the best example of that. And lastly, we've invested heavily this year, late last year and this year, into way more compliant standards, a higher fidelity of test, right? Supporting many, many more services. So I think the number of unique tests we have through the compliance standards is over 1,000 at this point. And the list of compliance standards that we support is growing as well. Okay, we're at the end. I still want to get to the product and talk a little bit about both deployment and sort of the kinds of information that Orca provides. I did want to talk a little bit about the off-the-shelf sort of integrations and sort of how Orca strives to fit into your workflow, but you see them here. We'll hopefully get a chance a little bit later. Okay, so let's pivot to our demo environment. So this is your Orca dashboard as it reloads. And how you use Orca differs a little bit. You saw a quick splash of the integrations. Certainly, they are useful for auto ticketing, logging. Connecting to your SIM strategy that your enterprise leverages. Certainly, but a lot of customers will leverage Orca also by API, right? Building it very specifically into processes. Everything you see me do in the console is available via API. In fact, a little bit more. We tend to build feature sets there first and then bring them to the UI. But as promised, let's talk about how easy it is to deploy Orca. It is a simple role and policy creation for AWS. But one of the things I want to talk to you about that's relatively new is the support for multiple accounts. If you are a growing organization that has chosen to leverage AWS organizations, which is, primarily sort of a billing mechanism, right, to allow different users, different applications to create cloud accounts and have them kind of all under one aggregated kind of billing scheme. There are certainly some technical advantages that come along with doing that as well, as we've leveraged in this support for multiple accounts. So if you do have that, Orca can attach to your organization, onboard all of those accounts, but then also watch that organization periodically. And when you debut a new account, auto deploy into it, right? And that's a really big change, right? We had tools, we had scripts to onboard multiple accounts long ago, but this is a productized way to do it with the mechanism that AWS encourages you to obviously use for scale out AWS account usage across your org. So one, we're really happy to support it the way that AWS wants it supported. And two, it's really great for our enterprise customers who, of course, are always looking for best practices for Orca to be able to, keep up with that growing cloud scale. I mean, that's a challenge. And so that support is new. But it really is simple as launching a CloudFormation based stack build. I mean, you can do this by hand if you want, but it's all very, very simple. And Orca only requests read-only permissions, and that's really, really important. There is some permission to encrypt that we ask for, but this is because when we take that side scan based snapshot, for our purposes of sort of deep interrogation, of course we re-encrypt that while we're doing so. We would never create data in any environment that isn't encrypted. But that's it. It's all about understanding the services you use. And let's take a look at the kind of information. We're close to the end, so I do want to get here quickly. So as Orca begins to work through those workloads, either initially as you first deploy or continuously on an ongoing basis, everything that's found is analyzed. Metadata about the findings are sent to the back end, and then they're amalgamated here and represented, throughout different categories. And the dashboard's great for sort of your top 5 in each, but most of your sort of deep alert consumption would be done in the dedicated kind of alert interface. And that's really because of the filters on the left-hand side. These are the very same alerts you see on the dashboard, and we can sort of deep dive investigate into them. But, you can filter here on the left-hand side. We can look at the kinds of, compromise. You'll find a lot of malware here. Malware with enough exposure is always indicative of, hey, how did it get here, right? A compromise happened. Malware without exposure, you can find kind of sometimes scored as imminent compromise. But really what I want to show you, and let's look at maybe software vulnerabilities. Actually, let's do a filter reset here. Let's blow this up a little bit so I can see a little better. Maybe you can too. Let's look at vulnerabilities, because one of the things I promised to show you is how Orca rolls these up, right? So if we take a look at this particular vulnerability, we can understand its attack vector. We can see exactly what the path is for exploitation, right? The attack vector. But let's delve a little deeper. And I'm conscious of the time. We're at the end. I'm going to steal a few more minutes. So this is all about, I have a poorly aging version of some old software, right? Clearly found from the side scanning process. And instead of dumping this big list of CVEs on you, what we've said effectively in this alert is, hey, you've got an aging version of Apache. If you update it, you will take care of all of these discrete software vulnerabilities. Right. And so when we talk, and this is what I alluded to when I said context isn't always about what's around the machine. Context is often sort of the reverse, where gee, I have a lot of software vulnerabilities. They're all linked to a particular poorly aging software package. If I do this, boy, will I save a lot of time in terms of security hygiene and taking care of these. And that's the idea is, what can I get to make the biggest difference in the shortest amount of time? We know we are flooding you with security alerts as an industry. We're trying to stop that, and context is the way we're doing it, right? The reason you see these alerts scored the way you do in that vulnerabilities is that these are quite exposed, right? These are less exposed. But again, exposure isn't the only thing that we talk about. We talk about is this vulnerability known to be remotely exploited? Is there a fix, right? Because if there's not a fix, what am I supposed to do about that from a software perspective necessarily, right? And again, none of this is information I don't want to know. It's just, what do I want to get into the hands of my security team to make a difference, to truly reduce the risk in my security posture? That's the goal, and that's why context is really woven, through everything we do. We talk about these deep workload risks, but you'll find other here as well. You'll find IAM misconfigurations, right? Clearly at the cloud control plane level, but they affect, what workloads can do, how many rights they have. Workloads can assume rights that are supplied from AWS, right? And so it's really, really important to right size those. And you'll find in IAM misconfigurations, and let's just go a little bit deeper, lots of poor hygiene where we can find a role that's kind of been orphaned that isn't used, that could easily be attached, to policy to create privilege. We need to be sure we're rid of that, right? And sort of all the way down, user defined alert is a little bit of a tease to what we've been developing lately. You may have seen it in the settings section, but compliance is really, before I leave you, compliance has probably got the next biggest kind of level of attention at Orca this year. And it has to do with both expanding, the number of compliance standards we offer. There used to be a handful. Now there's literally, I think, 30, and they range from very, very formal data security standards at the, the NIST, the ISO, and their derivatives, the GDPR level, all the way to cloud standards, CIS standards, and individual standards for applications and specific operating systems, right? So Orca really spans the gamut again, and that's part of that coverage and comprehensiveness in terms of our pillars that we really strive for, and it's a key design sort of characteristic. The other thing is, so two areas. One is the number of compliance standards, but then, as you can see here in alerts and automation, we have the ability to create custom alerts and create custom compliance measurements. Where we used the example of an S3 bucket. This is the last thing I'll say, and then I'll leave you. Sometimes an S3 bucket is meant to be public, right? We can serve websites out of S3 buckets, for example. So, if a compliance standards off the shelf says, hey, every S3 bucket that's public, I'm going to create a warning for and an alert for, that's what adds to that problem of, not really trusting the findings 100% of the time. You have to keep in the back of your mind that, that's fine. That one is actually intentionally public. And there's areas in our product where you can snooze alerts and snooze families of alerts, and you can go at it that way. But certainly from a longer term strategy, why not write a rule that says, hey, for every S3 bucket that, looks a certain way, exists in a certain geographical region, has a certain tag standard, judge it a specific way, and then judge all the rest the regular way, with the assumption that nothing should be public. And that's very, very kind of easy to do now in this new, very sort of custom alert framework. And so it's a rule builder that will let you iterate through, very, very specific, as you see, resources, and be able to measure them. And again, we're giving away a little bit of the roadmap here, but it's not just workloads, it's not just storage buckets, it's not just containers. Orca is very, very good at measuring lots of things, and through the use of measuring CloudTrail, if you're familiar with that service at AWS, we can get really, really specific about CloudTrail containing, specific entries, specific user attribution. We can trigger not only alerts, but as you may have seen in this interface, automations as well. Tickets, workflows, lots of capability there. So we're excited. We're going to be talking about that soon. As you saw, the beta moniker is still on it, but we're unwrapping that very, very soon, and we'll have some dedicated webinars and contents and workshops on that as well. Okay. So that's it. We're over time. I don't think we're going to have time to get to questions because of it. I'll look, and if there are questions, I'll get back to you for sure. I'll reply to them. I am at patrick@orca.security. Please do contact me. Certainly on the screen, you can see where we have a more product specific demo. A little bit of the same theory, but and there's other resources there as well. But if I can help you in any way, please do reach out. I'm at patrick@orca.security. Thank you.